The leader of UKIP, Nick Tenconi, made a speech in front of supporters where he called for political opponents to be hanged.
I say, when we deport the invaders, when we remigrate the communists, we ensure we give the British public a referendum on the death penalty. And the monsters, the Islamist monsters who rape and murder our girls, and the traitors in government, all of them, if found guilty, should face the noose in Parliament Square.
He said that traitors should face the noose. Now, elsewhere in the speech, he called for communists to be deported.
I will declare war on far-left extremism and the communists. I will carry out deportations of the communists, begin remigration, and send them to North Korea.
So even if you're born here, right, you're not an immigrant, he wants to deport people to North Korea for being communists. This is literally straight up Nazi rhetoric, right? The Nazis persecuted socialists, trade unionists, and communists, all right? Communists are the direct opposite of Nazis. Now, if you think I'm being hyperbolic, this is Tenconi recently doing a Nazi salute. He's also dancing like a bellend. He was doing the Donald Trump dance. But not only that, look at his armband. I mean, why would he do that, right? Have a look at the comparison. He knows exactly what he's doing. The only difference I can see is that he's bold. Now, we can see his online behavior, right? Telling people to go home for not being white. This is him saying it to the Green Party's Mothin Ali. And by the way, it's not the first time he's done it. He's done it loads of times. He said it to various people such as Ash Sarkar and Narinder Kaur. Now, this is him saying he supports remigration. So I've called for remigration since day one of becoming leader. Those who have British citizenship but do not belong here are going home. All right, so you heard that. Even if you have citizenship, and he says if you don't belong here, now, of course, what belong is entirely what he thinks belonging means. Now, what is remigration? Remigration is a far-right European concept of ethnic cleansing via the mass deportation of non-white immigrants and their descendants, sometimes including those born in Europe, to their place of racial ancestry. It is popular, especially within the identitarian movements. Now, look, to me, this shows that reform are not the biggest threat. It's what comes after, right? Reform winning, and I do think they're going to win the next election, I think it means the Overton window is going to shift again. And more people are going to fall into the Nazi propaganda and white supremacy. These ideologies, I think, are going to be far more emboldened. Now, our current Overton window is basically the centre-right to far-right nationalism. So the centre-right is like the left part of the Overton window. You know, it's not left-wing, but it's the left part of it, right? There is no real left-wing discourse in the mainstream. And the right think that this government is left-wing, because if you're far-right, bloody everything looks left-wing. But this government, to me, it's centre-right, with some things actually being firmly on the right, like their attack on trans people. Helena, this government prescribed Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation, despite posing no threat to people. The current UKIP leader is a Nazi. Like, he's literally a Nazi and is calling people to face the noose. So shouldn't UKIP be prescribed as terrorists?
I mean, I don't think that either of them should be prescribed as terrorists, basically because I don't agree with the stifling of free speech that the prescription legislation allows for. Obviously, what's happened with Palestine Action has led to even the discussion of talk about the actions of Palestine Action being potentially difficult. There's a chilling effect. When in reality, if you do prescribe these kind of people, if you seen all of the different kind of neo-Nazi groups across the country, you want to prescribe one group, another one will pop up in its place. It will change its rhetoric. It will use the same kind of euphemisms that were the preserve of the far right. For example, in America, you look at the quote that came from the previous kind of Jim Crow era, so you can't say the N-word anymore, so you use different euphemisms. This has been a thing that 4chan have perfected. It's been in the background of politics, both here and across the pond, since 2015, 2014. The reality is that trying to push one group out of the mainstream will result in another group existing in its place. It doesn't solve the problem, it just pushes it into the long grass to be found later down the line. And the worst part about all of this is that it makes these people feel like martyrs. It will raise the profile of these people and allow them to spread their message. For example, when this idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant, you look, for example, at Nick Griffin in his time as a leader of the BNP. They were seen as a fringe party, but there was a slow rise in their popularity. And the thought was, we'll put them on Question Time, and we'll give the platform for him to be exposed as the bigot and the charlatan and the monster that he is. And the reality is that he did have a terrible result on Question Time. Him being there, being the public eye, it being a prominent part of the discourse, whether it was bad for him or not, the reality is that the extra exposure increased support for the BNP despite the fact that it was bad for him. So the exposure of people like Nick Tanconi and his rhetoric further being emboldened by being martyred, by feeling that their free speech has been taken away through the use of prescription legislation, would only lead to the widening of the platform that can be used to spout the same rhetoric, even if it's not being done via the same group or via the same person or via the same political party. And the reality, of course, is that if you fold this into the current style of politics, you look at Reform UK, and the points you made about these people being emboldened and this rhetoric being mainstreamed, Nigel Farage's line throughout the election, and it's what he's basically been using, whether he was leader of the UKIP, whether he was leader of the Brexit Party or Reform UK, is actually, I am the thing that has stopped the far right in this country. My existence as a politician, of giving their right-wing movement in this country, like the far right movement in this country, a mainstream party to soften the rhetoric. I've always opposed people like Tommy Robinson, for example. Well, the reality is that the longer that Nigel Farage has been a mainstream figure in politics, the more these people have had their rhetoric in the public sphere. This idea that Nigel Farage being a mainstream politician is a silencing of the far right by there being a mainstream right-wing anti-migration party, that's just not been the case. We have seen riots on the streets, we've seen masked men going into asylum hotels, and now we're seeing open neo-Nazi rhetoric and neo-Nazi hand gestures and a desire for like open ethno-nationalism, right? Ethnic cleansing being made by what was once a political party that got 12% in the polls in 2015, for example. Nigel Farage's claim to being the person who silences the far right is just totally without merit. Because all we've seen, as you've mentioned before, of moving the Overton window right, is more of these people being given a platform and seeing their rhetoric mirrored in mainstream politics, with the mass deportation shit going under the Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef planning, and what we've seen, for example, coming out of America as well in the Trump regime. The idea that having a centre-right idea of the anti-migration party, again, all it's done is allow these people to feel like that they've been vindicated in terms of the ways in which that their rhetoric and their policies should be part of the mainstream discourse in this country.
Yeah. So I hear you, what you're saying about in terms of sort of freedom of speech, and also what utility does it hold to prescribe them as terrorists. What I do find incredibly funny, though, is the double standard from this government, though, because they've obviously prescribed Palestine Action. I don't think they're going to prescribe UKIP. Now, to me, who's more of a danger to society? It's UKIP, but they won't do that. So I think there's a double standard there. You're also absolutely right about Farage not being the antidote to the far right, because I think people like Farage and Reform have just been more clever in the way they address these policies. It's through dog whistles. To touch upon what you said about, was it the Redditors, and they said that, you can't use the N-word or whatever, and they've used dog whistles. Surely, though, in that instance, it's better they can't say it. So even though dog whistles are used to communicate with each other, it's kind of like political correctness, right? I think that political correctness served the purpose, because you made people feel uncomfortable to say these things, and actually it didn't spread as much. So is there not an argument to say we could censor these extreme voices, because even if they have to resort to using dog whistles, it's not apparent to the wider public, which means it seems like the racism is on the downward trend. Now, that's obviously doesn't necessarily mean it's the case, but I see it in terms of comparing it to political correctness. If you make people feel uncomfortable saying it, then at least there's some utility there.
Well, I think that is right, but that's got to come from social stigma rather than from the hands of the state. Because in reality, as you mentioned before, and as the Redditors and the Nazis in the background were doing with using these dog whistles, and when you look at America, for example, it was powerful enough for them to have the Unite the Right rally. The people with the tiki torches chanting "Jews will not replace us," right? That was born out of what Richard Spencer, the famous neo-Nazi, said was that they'd memed it into existence using Pepe the Frog as a unifying symbol for the 4chan style neo-Nazis, forcing them to do it in code, whilst it may stop it from going further than the online circles. It has at the very least been a calling card amongst them. But as I said, I think social stigma is the way they would do it. One thing I will say, one thing I think is really worth touching on here too, given that we're making this comparison to Palestine Action, for example, is that when you look at the talk about remigration, when you hear the stuff that comes out of the tweets that you put up there, going back to this perceived kind of racial ancestral homeland, for example, where have you heard the term ancestral homeland before? Well, who are the most prominent people in society talking about the necessity of an ancestral homeland? This idea that somehow every ethnicity has a place in the world, has a strip of land specifically that they belong in. Is it weird how the far right seem to really love Israel? Well, that's the reality. It's the reason why they like Israel. It's because it's the model ethnostate. It is, they believe that there is some kind of link between like an ethnic group and some kind of land, which is a preposterous idea to me. And it's their justification of saying, well, if we can get all the Jews out of Europe and into Israel, which is what was the meaning of the Balfour Declaration, it's anti-Semites wanting Jews out of Europe, essentially, is the justification for saying, well, all this ethnic group belong in this area of the world. Well, that means that all people of a certain ethnic group in the UK also belong back in the subcontinent, back in the Middle East, back in Africa, because that's where their ancestral homeland is. As if somehow, just because your ethnic group had ethnogenesis in a certain region, that means that that's where these people should live forever. Obviously it's a nonsensical idea, but this is why we have to push back against the Zionist narrative being mainstreamed. And that's why we've seen these things all kind of interlink at the same time, is because fundamentally the central part of the modern remigration narrative and the Zionism as anti-colonialism stuff is that it's all this comes from this basic idea that somehow land is connected to ethnicity when it just isn't. This is what they're trying to say. Like, England is for the English ethnic group specifically, rather than a nation of people or a community of people who live amongst each other regardless of their ethnicity, which is what Britain and England means to me. It's the people who I live with. It's the communities that I'm a member of. It's not any kind of ethnic group. And that's what fundamentally why you get this rhetoric of people being traitors, people undermining the nation, because fundamentally they see it as an ethnic identity rather than a community identity, right? And neoliberalism has caused an absence of a collective understanding of society, which has allowed there to be a power vacuum, an ideological vacuum for collectivists to fill it in the replacement of class politics with white identitarian politics. So we really need to get our act together to ensure that we can give people another narrative on why Starmer capitulating and refusing to engage in class politics has been the best gift that the right wing, that the far right especially, have had politically in this country. There's no counter narrative for an opposition to neoliberalism other than white nationalism and ethno-nationalism and white identitarianism.
Yeah, that point you're making, like class politics is fundamental to this rise of extremism, or the lack of class politics, right? But the question I have for you, right now, it feels like the toothpaste is out of the tube, right? Labour could bring in some really good changes. In fact, they've recently announced that they're going to expand childcare from 15 to 30 hours, right? And they could bring in some sweeping changes, but I feel like it's too late, Do you think that a left-wing party can only take on this far-right radicalism? Because Labour have destroyed all its goodwill. So even in the next year or two, they start making some popular policies. It's like like I said, the toothpaste is out the tube. The radicalism is already there.
I mean, we're already seeing globally, internationally, but especially within the global north, the collapse of the liberal capitalist order that was formed in the wake of the Second World War. Like, at least in terms of like the liberal basis of this, that's all collapsing, but it is collapsing because there has been no shackles on capitalism in a post-neoliberal world. The social democratic post-war consensus, the New Deal, which you would call it in the United States, for example, that all got blown apart by the free trade era in the 1980s. And of course, there has been no counterweight since the fall of communism in 1991, essentially, to force the capitalist West to be able to give something back to its citizens rather than allow rampant capitalist uh, subsuming of the wealth of these nations into the hands of very, very few. This was the reality that Marx talked about, right? In terms of the division between capital and labor, and the reality of what would happen if capitalism was untethered and unchained. And so, given that it's essentially expanded as far as it can in terms of the consent of the people who live in these societies to watch all of the assets of the world be subsumed by even fewer and fewer people, it was always going to end up leading to fascism. It's capitalism in decay. The reality is, if we want to look at the future where the global liberal capitalist order is breaking down, there is only two options. There is socialism and there is barbarism. And given there is no socialist alternative, at time of recording, outside of, I guess, hopefully Zach Polanski wins the leadership election, the Green Party tomorrow, people are turning to barbarism because there seems to be no alternative.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.